Good afternoon, everybody. It is my great pleasure to be able to welcome to APL-TCS-AAU 2019 to Bernard Stiegler, who is going to present on the topic of the post-truth era. Bernard Stiegler is currently president of the Institut de Recherche et d'Innovation du Centre Pompidou and of the Ars Industrialis Association. He was professor of philosophy at the Université de Technologie de Compiègne and is distinguished professor at Nanjing University, visiting professor at the China Academy of Arts in Hangzhou. He also taught at Humboldt University in Berlin, Leuphana University, London University Goldsmiths College, Cambridge University, Queen's College, École Polytechnique Fédérale in Zurich, and Northwestern University, Chicago. In 2010, he created the online school pharmacon.fr. He's published at least 36 books. I think it's more, probably. The main one is perhaps the many volumes of Technics and Time. It's a great pleasure to be able to welcome Bernard Stiegler to this, the first since 2013 Association of Philosophy and Literature. And it's a great pleasure also to be working with TCS and AAU, and most of all, it's a great pleasure to be able to welcome Bernard onto the podium to speak. You want to use this, or?
Yes, I have.
You have one.
I just need to connect my device. Yes, now it works. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be there and to find very good friends again. Thanks to the organizers, I thank a lot for inviting me today. The topic is post-truth. It's fiction, but then post-truth, the so-called post-truth era. What is called post-truth is not at all a result of media industries, also called cultural industries, and new media, digital new media, analog or digital media, for example, as social media. Post-truth era is the result of the negligence of philosophy as metaphysics. I use the term metaphysics in the sense of Karl Marx, talking about German idealism and more generally idealism, which is completely forgotten by Alain Badiou, for example, as well as in the sense of Nietzsche and Heidegger. Now, the oblivion, which is such a negligence, affects these philosophers themselves, as they pretend to critique metaphysics themselves, Marx accepted, in my view, and Derrida included. Such a negligence is the one designated in the last sentence of Socrates, according to Phaedo. Oh, I'm sorry, it's not this one. This is the last sentence quoted in Phaedo. Pay the debt and not neglect it. You remember that. The question here is, what does it mean to pay the debt in the age of modern technology? That is, in the age of knowledge, reduced by capitalism to a function of production, as it was anticipated by Marx in the Grundrisse, in the global economic war, leading the apocalypse of the Anthropocene era. Socrates pays the debt to Asclepios, that is, to the pharmacist, whose caduceus to the snake is doubled by that of Hermes, the god playing with snakes, and whose own caduceus includes 2 serpents. I'm sorry. We also must remember here that Anaximander talks about debt and price. And we must reread Heidegger when he talks about Gestell and above all Ereignis. Heidegger is the only one who really saw the stakes of what he himself called then the oblivion. And I invert my images. Now, this debt or Schuld is not a fault. It's not a sin. It is the price of the default of origin, where you can see the 2 snakes here of Hermes, where, as you can see, there is always a snake, for example, here. What is this snake? It is what is neglected by philosophy from its origin in order to deny its default of origin, that is, from Plato, himself misinterpreting this Socrates' last sentence, I believe. This question is the one concerning technology, that is, today, modern technology, which needs a reconsideration of the question of techne. And it is this horizon beyond guilty that Heidegger cannot really think in its link with techne. He tried to do that, but I consider he failed. Here, before developing this, I want to highlight that the stake of techne and decay, that is here in Protagoras, as decay is the object of logos, or reason, as it is not reducible to ratio, that is, calculation, this stake is a process happening into the biosphere, becoming a technosphere in the sense of Vladimir Vernadsky, Arnold Toynbee, and Alfred Lotka. Such a becoming happens through a process of exhaust-somatization that was addressed by your talk previously, beginning 3 million years ago, which is also an exorganogenesis of the noesis of thinking. And to this extent, it is a noogenesis. Here, a new stage of exhaust-somatization is not better or worse than any previous one. For example, shamanic culture is neither better nor worse than apodictic culture, coming from Greece, or ideographic culture, like in Confucianism in China. First, because if apodictic culture forgets shamanic culture, that is also in Homeric times the tragic culture of the serpent, it becomes stupidity. That is, in my own definition of stupidity, entropy, as it is incapable to protect and take care of diversity and then and biodiversity. These two shortly said, let's try to approach the terrible question of the post-truth ordeal, that is not only an era, but an ordeal and a test. This being Heidegger's conception of the Gestell, where the Dasein is no longer the stake. The following question remaining, what does that mean? Da, that is, there. Unfortunately, I couldn't attend to the conference by the Professor Malpass addressing this question, and I really regret that, but I will try to find the text for reading it. I will just add this now. The there about the da and the there designates the access to what I call the noetic necro-mass, that Edouard Glissant and Achille Mbembe, and I'm very happy to meet him here, call alluvium, that is, for me, more generally, humus. Not only of the biosphere, hitting the necrosphere constituted by such a necro-mass. Necro-mass was coined, the concept coined by Vladimir Vernadsky, and necro-mass is providing carbon to biomass. This being the condition of the noetic necro-mass itself, constituted by what I call tertiary retentions and tertiary protensions. This field of tertiary pretension today being explored by Yu Qi, the Chinese philosopher, in the specific stage of digital objects. Let's remind here that techne, according to Plato, particularly since the book 7 of Politeia, is fiction. This is the topic of our encounter. And that in such an extent as episteme is a way towards the truth of being, techne is contingent, not necessary for Plato, of course, not being, but becoming. That is, what can be other than it is, etc. Aristotle calling this in the Ethic to Nicomachus, to endekomenon allos ekein. This is a stake of Book 7 of Plato's Republic, then. In the cave, everything is contingent, so truth is only in the light of sun, outside techne and becoming. This is what Serge Danet called metaphysics as photology in his discussions with Gilles Deleuze. Now we know that the whole biosphere is such a cave. Oh, I'm sorry. I wanted to show you what I call the exospheric organism of the biosphere with satellites around the Earth. And we know that there are no heavens, nothing that is not immanent. In this lecture, in order to approach these considerations and to check them, we will reflect on this post-truth era, if it is an era. And if it is an era, what kind of era is it? Is it, for example, the Anthropocene era, that is a modern and industrial technology? This is the question. We will reflect then on this by resituating it in terms of the building site of thinking opened in the 20th century by Martin Heidegger. Heidegger proposed that truth has a history, and that the historicity of truth is the essence of truth. That being is therefore time, and time is being. So that the history of truth also amounts to a history of being, where the latter occurs through a privileged being that he calls Dasein. Obviously, we cannot ignore the fact that Heidegger himself, at the very moment he was studying what he would come to call the history of truth, was deceived by something like a first global experience of the post-truth era, if it is true that Heidegger was clearly a Nazi. And if it is true that long after his period as a rector of a university under Nazism, he remained an anti-Semite, something which can be read into the frightening statements of this work that would put forward the concept of Gelassenheit. That is, for me, a catastrophe. And I tried to show in a book entitled Dans la Description why and how this book particularly is a symptom of this illness of the West, that anti-Semitism is as a kind of racism, but not only racism. And when Heidegger said, for example, I disagreed with Nazi about biologism, this is classical racism. But you can say, no, I don't agree with biologism, and you can stay an anti-Semite, of course. So it's not an argument for excuse this. Now, my problem is not to accuse at all. It's not at all my problem. It is to understand and to analyze and to draw the consequences of these problems happening in the 30s. It is, however, precisely with Heidegger that we must try to think the possibility of a post-truth and to understand what post could mean here without being content to hear on this post an echo of so-called, for example, postmodernity, which is a rather catch-all concept, or to hear it in terms of what is variously referred to as post-phenomenology, for example, post-structuralism, post-Marxism, and so on. Here it is perhaps a question of hearing in the post of truth the quasi-causal possibility of a leap, in German, ein Sprung, beyond this test of, or this ordeal, which is also that of the Anthropocene in its disruption, in its disruptive period. This link between the Anthropocene and post-truth obviously being more than just a coincidence. Such a leap beyond post-truth must be attempted with Heidegger then, and even more particularly by reconstructing the path along which Heidegger lost his way, but which nevertheless can cause us to think not only the possibility but the imperative nature of a leap starting from what he called the Gestell and towards what he called the I-ness, which obviously does not mean that we should interpret Heidegger's last thoughts in the same way that Heidegger did himself. Here, more than ever, what Heidegger said about limits in the famous Kant and the Problem of Metaphysics, which he did by quoting Kant, must not only be recalled, but resolutely practiced, failing which we will sink either into idolatrous forms of reading or into sterile imprecations like this stupid one, which is in the end always an approach steeped in denial, which inverts the denial which we deny the necessity of thinking in French, penser with an E, and of caring, that is in French, penser with an A. Penser la différence. Treating the difference with an A. Taking care of the difference with an A. That is pharmacological. This is the stake. Plato inaugurated philosophy itself, and I will argue the paradoxical thesis that Socrates is himself ultimately at the limit, pre-Socratic, where this word, limit, will come to occupy the focus of our attention. We must study Plato with and through Heidegger, Heidegger constituting here two, just as much, one particular way, that is a bias, but an inevitable bias, whose character as bias must be analyzed as such. It is only in this way that it is possible to return to something that amounts to more than just a source, a spring, as we could say in English. That is, this one is the one of Danube, being an object of mediation of Hölderlin's The Easter by Heidegger, a spring then which is perhaps also a Sprung. If it is true that every source is always, in the history of truth, a kind of leap. I've argued in Technics and Time 1 that in Sein und Zeit, Heidegger comes very close to the question of what I call tertiary retention, which is the inscription in the world, that is the trace, Spur, and in a technical, that is exteriorized form, of the past of Dasein. The inscription of a past that this Dasein has not lived, which has accumulated before it and has accumulated as world, Welt, which this Dasein inherits and does so actively, that is, through its education that begins from the first day of its coming into the world. This is the beginning of life, And this past into the baby enters, accumulated and generally buried, that is also, and first of all, a noetic humus, a noetic necro-mass buried but not erased. This past, in this way, constitutes a world. And in order to come into this world, education must not be content just to reproduce the past, but must, on the contrary, individuate it, in the sense developed, of course, by Gilbert Simoneau in this book, that is, interpret it. Such an interpretation as the individuation of the past is also a worlding of the world, a making world, as Heidegger says, the question of which, too, is dealt with in Holzwege and especially in relationship with this work, to this work, of which it is a matter of understanding what it opens up, a world. And in order to interpret a past that it has not been lived, and that Simoneau describes as its pre-individual ground or fence, which Deleuze often referred to, including here, and that I myself present in this way for a long time, individuation, which Simoneau tells us, is always both psychic and collective. And we will need to discover to what extent this is also of Dasein. Needs this individuation, needs knowledge. This knowledge, which is the issue of Tetetus, and which, as we will see, led Heidegger to revisit the presentation of this question in Plato's final period. If we follow Léon Robin's reconstruction of the Platonic corpus here, for example, this knowledge then is, in all its forms, that which provides the criteria of interpretation, that is, of selection. This is not Heidegger's point of view. It is the point of view that I myself argue for by building on Socrates, Husserl, Nietzsche, and Derrida, but at the same time by distancing myself from Husserl, Nietzsche, and Derrida, if not from Socrates, of whom we have only the traces left to us by Plato and those who copied his texts, that are what I call alphabetic, hypomnasic, and literal tertiary retentions. In the course of my research, I have endeavored to show that this process of selection begins with perception, so that the later being temporal, that is constituting inner sense, which is also for Immanuel Kant in this book, the form of time, that constitutes the transcendental aesthetic, the effective operation of which is the synthesis of understanding by the transcendental imagination. Any perception is first and foremost the process of receiving or gathering what Husserl called primary retention, that I write like this. These primary attention are ultimately, nevertheless, this is not what is said by Husserl at the beginning, primary selections, where these selections are effected on the basis of criteria, and where those criteria are secondary retentions, which I note like this one. Secondary retentions are former primary retentions, that is, former primary selections. Former retentions that constitute, in a primary way, a phenomenon as present, and in the time of its flowing through the inner sense, in the Kantian sense. I insist on this question of the present because, as we will see, it is, in a certain way, aletheia, as Anwesenheit and Gegenwart. These are then former selections, tertiary, secondary retention, that have subsequently become memories. That is something that comes from the past. As such, they constitute what David Hume, for example, described as habits. Secondary retentions are psychic. But there are secondary retentions that become social, that is, collective. In so doing, they form knowledge of how to live, how to do, how to conceive, how to pray, etc. These various kinds of knowledge are transmitted, and this transmission occurs mainly through the process of education, as we already saw, the latter being the sole pathway by which nascent Dasein can enter into the world. Consequently, I distinguish between psychic secondary retentions and what I call collective secondary retentions. It is the sharing in Greek, the moira, of such collective secondary retentions inasmuch as they engender collective expectations, or in other words, collective pretensions. It is this sharing of collective retentions constituting a non-lived and yet inherited past, which is thus also a sharing of collective pretensions, hopes, desire, will, etc., constituting the horizon of a common and desirable future that forms that we will call an epoch. Such an epoch, for example, an epoch of being, is also what Heidegger called the understanding that their being has of its being, where the latter is, as he says, shored up by an average and vague understanding of being. This is in Sein Insight, paragraph 2. But conceived in this way, an epoch is what implements and at the same time invents, discovers, and metastabilizes criteria through crisis, in which former criteria disappear in favor of new criteria. This critical play of retentions and pretensions through which an epoch is formed, and is formed as Bildung, constitutes what I call a process of transindividuation that I note like this. Techniques in Time 1, The Fault of Epimetheus, is the attempt to show that the play of the psychic and collective retentions and pretensions that constitute an epoch is always conditioned at every step by tertiary retentions, which are the spatialized traces of conscious time, spatialized in the most diverse forms, firstly by tools and instruments, which appeared some 3 million years ago, then by the hypomnesic tertiary retentions that appeared in the Upper Paleolithic period. The critical play between first these tertiarized retentions and second primary and secondary retentions engenders pretensions and falls within the scope of the process that Derrida called difference with the A, which is, as you know, temporalization and spatialization, and vice versa. But if difference with the A constitutes epochality, which Heidegger also named Geschichtlichkeit, it does so noetically, which means, on the one hand, that it proceeds from a process of exhaust-somatization, a term I have borrowed from Alfred Lotka in this text. On the other hand, that is noetized as praxis and not just as poiesis. But most likely, this is not only starting from the Upper Paleolithic, where the later constitutes the age of grammatization in the sense described by André Leroy-Gourand in Gesture and Speech, and which is also the age of Lascaux, those caves that, for Georges Bataille, would signify the birth of art. If there is any necessity to what transpires during this lecture, it will be the experience of a hermeneia of that of which the world consists in the era of post-truth, an era that is in truth that of an absence of epoch. No collective pretensions, no collective retentions, only data and algorithms, only computation. The path traced by Heidegger is something we would need to retrace. If not step by step, then at least in its manifold sinuousness, because only Zeit enables a close approach to the question of tertiary retention and of what ultimately constitutes its perpetually renewed problem, question, and secret, namely the pharmacon. This photo was made by Abby Warburg in Mexico. The pharmacon, which I represent here with this photo by Abby Warburg, took in the late 19th century at the beginning of the work of Warburg, and which I argue symbolizes this pharmacon that haunted Warburg from the beginning to end, the end being this Kreuzlingen lecture where he discussed the snake with Ludwig Binswanger. From the Hopi ritual to the bronze serpent of the Bible. Heidegger's closest approach to these questions occurs in paragraph 76 of Zeit. But this highly proximal approach is at the same time a distal recoil. Heidegger recoils from the very thing he approaches so closely, and this is precisely what opens up Erstreckung as the very possibility of the close and the distant, as he says himself. It is starting from these questions in Techniques in Time 1 that I have argued that the history of truth is the epiphylogenetic history of a form of life that, with Georges Canguilhem, I also call technical life, on more recently with Lotka, exhaust-somatic life. In what follows, I will try to convince you that thinking, conceiving, and interpreting the history of truth requires us to also undertake a history of noises, not only truth and thinking and being. The latter being conditioned by the history of hypomnesic tertiary retention, that is, by the history of what is called here grammatization, not in the sense of Derrida's grammatology, but in the sense of the production of tagrammata in the letters of writing, letters or ideograms. The question of the pharmacon, a question that Heidegger ultimately avoids, even though in the final reckoning, and especially at the end of his thinking, he really speaks of nothing else, is the question that obviously found its way to me through Derrida, but it is that I did not just stick to his analysis, however original and decisive it is in many respects. Finally, all this should be situated in the context without epoch of the end of the Anthropocene, as it is a gestalt, that is, in the context of a disruption that fundamentally proceeds from cybernetics and articulates submarine networks, for example, like here, but also satellite networks via data centers, and captures the data of the being that we ourselves are, and does so in order to render calculable and algorithmically treatable all the forms of retention and pretension in which consist what we call existence in exhaust-somatization, and where difference with an A, as noetic difference with an A, is not only as vital difference with an A, and must be as existence with an A. And we will also see that this means that we ought to conceive thinking, penser, with an E, as that which consists in caring for, pensée with A. That is, in taking care, that is also what Zeinunzeit calls Sorge. Let's summarize. First, Heidegger, let's try to summarize. Heidegger raises the question of the history of truth by continuously circling around the question of the pharmacon and tertiary retention, which arise from the exhaust-somatic condition of existence with A. Yet, despite this, Heidegger never engages with this issue, for reasons that we'll not try to elucidate today, but that have everything to do with his Nazi anti-Semitic corruption. Second, it is Derrida who opens the path that leads to this rereading of Heidegger, and does so starting from the trace, the erasure of being, and the pharmacon as hypomnesic condition of anamnesis. But Derrida did not himself follow this path out to the end, which is also the Gestalt as experience of disruption, which is also to say of the Capitalocene, that is the Anthropocene. While on this road, Derrida abandons the direction that aims at the pharmacon, changing course towards undecidability without having delineated the polarity wherein the pharmacon is experienced precisely as the undecidable about which we must nevertheless decide. This is the real question of Derrida, and the most interesting one, but we must articulate it with the pharmacon. Third, all this rests as well on the question of the tragic in the Greeks that Nietzsche introduced in his Dionysian philology. Fourth, by introducing the concept of exhaust-somatization, the rereading of Derrida with Simondon is immediately given a new depth and perspective, enabling difference with the A to become something we can treat or care of, penser with the A, with the concept of sidereal, vital, and psychosocial individuation. So the rearticulation between Derrida and Simondon, that is also Deleuze, is the stake. Such a program belongs to what I call a neganthropology. This word is a kind of reply to Claude Lévi-Strauss in this book when he said that anthropology should be better written anthropology. I myself claim that Anthropocene should better be written Anthropocene, that we have to escape such an Anthropocene by introducing a new era of truth. And for this, we need a neo-functionalist approach of the history of truth that could and should lead to the so-called post-truth era. Now, this post-truth stage of this history could open the possibility of a new era of truth, I said, the era of neganthropocene, as an era where truth is defined as a function of the exosomatic form of life. That is also the stake of this book by Georges Canguilhem, and that is also the genuine stake of what Heidegger called Ereignis. This one being thinkable only considering the Gestalt, as it is also the stage of Bestand and Ereignis. And the stake of what Achille Mbembe calls le devenir nègre, the becoming black. For this, we need first to reconsider the concept of neganthropic organogenesis or exorganogenesis, informational negantropy and exhaust-somatization, questions that are addressed by Norbert Wiener, for example, here, but in a vocabulary that remains the one of metaphysics. Second, to requalify the metaphysical terms in which those concepts were elaborated after thermodynamics. And for this, we have to reread Plato and to requalify Socrates' statements below and beyond Plato. Now, Remembering Heidegger's remarks about this moment of the history of truth that is politeia, book 7, and to understand why the evolution from neganthropic organogenesis, this is a neganthropic organogenesis, that is here the one described by Lamarck at the end of the 18th century, as well as Schrödinger in 1943, and the relationship between exhaust-somatization and entropy, that is the stake of both Lotka's analysis in this paper and also Georgescu Reagan's work in this book, to understand why such an evolution then is the condition of truth, as it is such a history that is linked to the evolution of artifacts, that I call tertiary retentions. We need to revisit Heidegger's deconstruction of this history from the new point of view that the Anthropocene is, and to connect this with Heidegger's consideration about Gestalt and Ereignis. For that, we must reconsider also what Kant called the conflict of the faculties, in order to think, penser with the E, and treat and care, penser with the A. That is also the question between theory and practice. The new conflict of the faculties and functions engendered by the evolution of tertiary retentions when becoming digital and algorithmic. For this, it is necessary to overcome the current conception of negantropy. Noesis being itself, in my view, what produces neganthropic bifurcations, such a concept of bifurcation coming from Whitehead in this book. Before concluding by talking a little bit more about these perspectives, I must here highlight that ancient Greece ignored, of course, the question of entropy, and Heidegger chooses to ignore it too. He rejected it. Why? This is the real problem. The concept of entropy describes the thermodynamic process, in this book, and it has been extended to the field of biology as negative entropy in this book. That is, when I say negative entropy, for me it's not at all the theory of information. It is a theory of life, because the theory of information is a misunderstanding of this the question of negative entropy in the sense of Schrödinger. And such a negative entropy is a deferral of entropy, that is, something that we might call the difference of entropy, in Derrida's sense then, for indeed this leads to the spatialization, in the sense described here by Derrida, of what we will describe in what follows as an organogenesis, whether this is endosomatic or exhaust-somatic. As you know, difference with the A for Derrida is concerning life in general, not humankind, for example, not only humankind. For me, there is a difference happening with what I call the noetic difference, because it becomes exosomatic, and not only the living question, the question of life, not only, it is also the question of death, and also what I call noetic necro-mass. There have been countless attempts to transplant the concepts of entropy and negantropy to the fields of information theory, cybernetics, communication theories, system theories, complexity theory, in the pursuit ultimately of various attempts to formalize the human sciences and social sciences. In addition, in the bioeconomics by Nicholas Georgescu-Reagan, the increase in the rate of entropy and its reduction as low entropy, that is, a local slowing down of the entropic process, become the nodal points of economics itself, which approaches in terms of the fact that exhaust-somatic organogenesis, and here you can see the growth of the exhaust-somatic organogenesis in the process of hominization according to Leroy-Gourand, exhaust-somatic organogenesis distinguishes the economic being that we must be from living things, which are neganthropic thanks only to their endosomatic organogenesis, which is itself spontaneously economic, so to speak, due to the pressures of selection as biology describes it. What we will call Gestalt after Heidegger constitutes the contemporary infrastructures of knowledge. These infrastructures are those of a technological and industrial development of knowledge and of the faculty of knowing in general that is also called the post-truth era. This is the post-truth era. Post-truth era is the transformation of knowledge into a function of production. And that's only this. The post-truth stage of the history of truth is occurring then in the context of the rise of what we now call big data and the high-performance computing that makes its production possible in the form of the production of patterns, that is the establishing of correlations. In this context, too, a viewpoint has arisen that in transhumanist ideology anticipates a point of bifurcation which is referred to in particular by Kurzweil as a singularity. And it is striking to observe that this discourse, which thus anticipates a typing point, which is to say a singularity in the mathematical and physical sense of the term, puts forward in this very gesture two theses whose conjunction warrants serious consideration, but which here I have time only to mention. On the one hand, it asserts that a bifurcation is coming when machines will become more intelligent than their creators, ourselves and our fellow human beings. And on the other hand, it takes for granted that on the basis of this intelligence, we, or our fellows, who will then be less intelligent than our exhaust-somatic production, will nevertheless be able to become immortals. It's an incredible contradiction. Absolutely stupid. But nobody says anything about it, this stupidity. It is in relation to this utterly fanciful and dual perspective, backed as it is by transhumanist ideology, that we should analyze and criticize the discourse of Chris Anderson, that is much more important, of course, whose formal and fundamental errors, if I can put it like that, I have analyzed here, and so will not go into again here. But following this, and complementary to it, I would like now to recall my argument in Techniques in Time 3 and to make a case for 5 theses that will complete it. My first thesis asserts that what is at stake both in the violent delirium and the Andersonian entrepreneurial strategy involves the faculties of knowing, desiring, and judging in the Kantian sense. But to mobilize Kant against these ideologies, characteristic of the disruptive period into which the Anthropocene, that is the Capitalocene, as I said, has entered, and within which a shift is readying itself, that has nothing to do with singularity in the transhumanist sense, but everything to do with the end of theory in Anderson's sense. We must critique Kant himself by showing how he lacks an exhaust-somatic conception of the schematism and of that imagination he referred to as transcendental. It was a critique of this sort that I tried to outline in Techniques in Time 3 by showing that artificial retention, or what I call tertiary retention, is a condition of any noetic retention and pretension whatsoever, that is, of any rationality. My second thesis is that the faculty of knowing has evolved in the course of what Lotka named exhaust-somatization and as the progressive exteriorization, that is a difference with A, but as noetic difference and not only vital difference. A progressive exteriorization and difference with A, the functions of the faculty of knowing, and in particular of the intuition through instruments of observation. For example, this one is very striking, but you can find many other examples, of course, of the understanding, particularly with computing and information technology, starting with Leibniz, of the imagination when instruments of observation become instruments for the production of behavioral programs that via what Adorno called industry of cultural goods, etc., etc. As you can see, I mean that difference with A means deferral of entropy, but this deferral can be either endosomatic, that is a negantropic, and the negantropic difference, negantropic is an A and an H, produces an exorganogenesis that needs noesis. In order, noesis in the sense of beginning of thinking by, of formalization by philosophy of what is thinking. In order to give criteria to select the exosomatic possibilities on inventions or of practices, and this is what is said here by Lotka, I recommend you to read this text that is extremely important and easy. It's a very short one, 20 pages, and it's very easy to find on the web. Truth is the function of such a selection as a principle of negantropy, difference, neganthropological difference that is always evolving with the appearance of hypomnesic tertiary attention from the beginning of Upper Paleolithic. The Gestalt is an accomplishment of such an organogenesis, producing what Vernadsky in this book called the Technosphere. That is the first explanation of what is Gestalt for me. To approach das Ereignis, it is to go further Heidegger with the question of negantropy in order to reach the neganthropocene era based on what I call a neganthropology. Such is, in my view, the question of truth today as fiction and as the ordeal of post-truth and technology. To conclude, the neganthropological approach of the originary default of origin leading to the technosphere is the only way for treating any kind of ethnocentrism, like, for example, the Nazism as a kind of radical ethnocentrism. Now, such a view is not at all an ignorance of specificities of localities, understood as types of time and space, themselves constituting calendarities and cardinalities as they made possible such a biospheric transformation, in the end constituting the technosphere, the exosphere, called Gestalt by Heidegger. To struggle against such an ignorance, that is an oblivion and a negligence, is to reactivate the noetic necro-mass or noetic humus or alluvium constituted by tertiary tensions as well as landscapes, and then as geographic and ecological places, as they still constitute the no diversity that is based on locality necessarily, and Schrödinger explained why, and it is impossible to overcome this locality. For example, providing the wisdom of experiences as coined, forged, and transmitted in Africa, America, Asia, Australia, and Oceania. In the age of Gestalt, the Western Europe and the Eastern Europe, as well as cultures of Africa, America, Asia, Australia, and Oceania have been destroyed. And nevertheless, today, in the north of the suburbs of Paris, culture of West Africa, for example, as it has not been totally erased, gives me the opportunity to launch a new kind of economy that we call contributory economy of mechanics in order to struggle against the catastrophe to come by reinventing an economy that is based on knowledge beyond total prioritization. I say that because what is important here is to transform these very conceptual and speculative questions into practical proposals. If we follow, for example, Antonio Guterres talking 1 year ago at the United Nations and 6 months ago, not 6 months, 9 months ago at the Davos Forum, we have now all of us to mobilize us to struggle against entropy. And it is really urgent to transform our theoretical concerns into practical discussions. So thank you very much for your attention. Merci.
Thank you very much, Bernard, for a truly interesting, challenging talk. There's time for questions, and I'm sure there will be questions from the floor. There's Scott up here. You can get a microphone.
Only this, I think it seems very clear that central to your thinking is some idea of noetic necro-mass. I think Achille speaks about a necropolitics, don't you? We'll talk about that later, but I wonder if you could just kind of say what this is. I mean, what you mean by noetic, and also what you mean by necro-mass, because I think that's very central to your idea of neg-Anthropocene. Just clarify what you mean by noetic necro-mass. Yeah.
What I mean noetic is what gives criteria to decide into the process of exhaust-somatization. For example, let's decide we will create the possibility of, let's call, neurotechnologies, for example, equipping the brain, for example, or not. And first, and second, how to practice them, because they are pharmaca. So you have always a possibility to produce entropy or negentropy with these technologies. And as it was showed by Lascaux, who is extremely important for this reason, it's not at all the case with an endosomatic organ. You don't have to decide how your heart will work or your brain. It works. Sometimes it doesn't work because you are ill, and you have a process of production of entropy, but it is a dysfunctioning. And now in negentropic, in exosomatic life, it is exactly the contrary. This is the reason for which Lascaux says, if you don't have knowledge, that is therapy. For Lascaux, knowledge is therapy, exactly like for Canguilhem. You cannot live with exosomatic organs.
So Heidegger's Gestell, for you, or for us, is part of an entropic move.
Sorry?
Heidegger's Gestell is part of an entropic development, which is also in the direction of kind of this sort of post-truth.
Heidegger's Gestell is the transformation of the necro-mass into a purely calculable set of data.
Okay.
And this is extremely clearly said by Heidegger in the 50s. Heidegger, as you know, read Wiener, and he understood very well the stakes. He saw extremely quickly that something was completely changing in the history of being, as he said, and he said, now being is technology. Okay. And it is technology because of calculation. Now, I think that Heidegger didn't understand Wiener. Why? Because he rejected the theory of entropy and negentropy. What is extremely striking for me is a rejection of the theory of entropy and negentropy by all philosophers but Bergson. You know, Heidegger never talks about entropy. Derrida wants to avoid the question of entropy. Nietzsche says entropy is a fantasy. You have only, and Marx and Engels say in the directive of nature, entropy is not dialectizable, so it's wrong. You have only two thinkers understanding what is happening with entropy, Bergson and Freud.
And Freud.
And Freud, yes.
The death drive.
The death drive is entropy for Freud. And life drive is a kind of negentropy. You cannot use this term because it was not coined at this time. It was coined 20 years later. But it is the stake of beyond the pleasure principle by Freud. Now, what is a necro-mass? The necro-mass, a path in a landscape is already necro-mass. Noetic necro-mass. All traces you produce into the biosphere as they are produced in a systematically exhaust-somatized production of traces are necromatic, if I can say that. So this is the basis of archaeology. But archaeology in the sense of archaeologues, but also archaeology in the sense of Foucault, of Nietzsche, etc., of Derrida, of course. The question of archives. So, of course, here the work of Achille Mbembe is extremely important as a question of politics of necromass. So, but we will discuss that tomorrow. So I don't, I don't start now. Thank you for your question.
There's a question up here.
Thank you, Bernard. I was a little bit unclear as to what you meant by the exhaust-somatic. Is it a kind of new concept, a new experience that you're describing, something that characterizes a kind of particular place and time? Or is it a concept that describes all host of experiences and thoughts and conceptualizations that we have from a very long time now? About how kind of action, for instance, is articulated, how we're not, body and mind are combined. I wasn't sure whether you're describing a new experience or you have a new concept for an old experience. I wasn't clear on that, so it's just a small clarification.
It's not at all a new experience. It's a very old one, even with animals, because you have exhaust-somatic also productions in animality. But this is what is described by Lotka. It's important to precise that Lotka developed this conception from two experiences, the First World War and the Second World War. He explains that. He said in 1945, he read a report about the victims of the Second World War in Europe, and he said, it's incredible how destructive is the exhaust-somatic production of humans. And then he revisited what he already said in 1922 after the First World War when he addressed the question of entropy. Lotka was a mathematician, and he became a biologist applying mathematics and probabilities of entropy theory to biology of populations and genetics of population. And after the Second World War, he produced this view in which he says you cannot understand what happens with humans only with biology. It's impossible. So the human is not a Darwinist production. Now you have, it's now me who speaks, you have exhaust-somatization in animality, of course. But the problem is what becomes the criterion of evolution. In the case of, for example, apes, this criterion is still the struggle for life under the constraints of biology. Even if there is a period in which it's extremely difficult to find it. What is such a period? The default of a regime. So you don't have an origin. You cannot say this is the beginning of humankind because, as we said in the previous round table, humankind doesn't exist. It's only the fantasy produced of a future through the problems of exhaust-somatization in which you have to choose between possibilities. And Toynbee says this is the origin of morality. Toynbee says it's a very important and interesting statement at the beginning of the, I don't remember the title in English, in French it is L'aventure humaine. He says morality is only the problem to decide with artifices, with technology, with exhaust-somatization. He knew Lotka, he knew Vernadsky, etc., Toynbee. And for me, Toynbee is a very, very important thinker and historian. So the question is, with this conception coined by Lotka, we can reinterpret all what you said. For example, we can reread also, I can't remember the name now, Vygotsky, because Vygotsky developed very interesting statements about psychology, the relationship between the ego and the society, etc. He tried to develop a so-called materialist view, but he didn't know this. And if you can mobilize Lotka, it gives something completely new for interpreting Vygotsky. But also all the questions of cognitivism can be reinterpreted from such a point of view. And here, the question is that you cannot reduce anything to calculation. And when I say that, it's an occasion for me to precise why I think there was always a kind of anti-Semitism in Heidegger. It is because Heidegger considered that the Jewish people or culture was based on calculation, that is a stereotype, and that calculation is always destroying thinking. And I don't agree with that. To think is calculating. You need to calculate. So the question is not to oppose to calculation. It is to transform calculation that is entropic into negentropy, into something that is capable to produce the incalculable. And the stake of that is what is said by Paul Claudel when he says that in a poem you have always a number that impedes you to calculate. That is, a poet or a musician is the one who uses calculation, against probability. And I think I was for 5 years ahead of IRCAM, that is the Institute for Musicology of Paris, founded by Boulez, and it is a stake of such an institute, how to use software, for example, for producing something that is not calculable.
There's a question here.
Hi, thank you very much for that. I was interested in two of the last statements that you had made. On the one hand, of différance as being negentropic, and on the other of neganthropology as inaugurating the epoch of truth as fiction. You mentioned earlier in the thing about Derrida never mentioning anything about entropy, but there's a passage in the différance essay where he says, on the one hand, we need to think of différance as the delay of presence.
Excuse me, I don't understand very well. If you could speak
louder,
to the
sure.
microphone. Yes,
Okay.
I'm sorry. Yeah.
So, yeah, basically I was just asking about two of the last things that you'd mentioned about différance on the one hand as being negentropic, and on the other hand of neganthropology as inaugurating the epoch of truth as fiction. So there's a moment in the différance essay that I think Derrida does anticipate something in the sense of entropy that would figure into his lectures on theoretical biology in the 70s. He says, on the one hand, how do we think différance as a delay of presence, supplementation of the same in the other? But on the other hand, how do we think différance as an irreversible expenditure of energy, an irreversible loss of presence as Freudian death drive, as a relationship to a past that's never been present, right? So it seems to me that there's this entropic movement in différance that I think he gets from Georges Bataille, in a sense, the movement of general economy. He says that it's impossible to think the two together. On the one hand, différance is negentropic, if we can say in one way, and on the other, différance as entropy. Now, when he does develop entropy in the seminars that have just been published recently, La Vie de Mort, there's a sense in which it's very close to your own work in the sense that he rejects François Jacob's notion of information as being negentropic, right? There's a sense in which entropy exceeds all calculations. So I suppose my question is, if there is that irreversible movement of entropy in différance, what happens to the question of truth as fiction for neganthropology? You know, for Deleuze, for example, entropy is a transcendental illusion. He says that in the third synthesis of time. I guess that's my...
Yes. I think that you are completely right, of course, and this publishing of La Vie la Mort is an important moment in the reception of Derrida, because this seminar was very, very important for Derrida. Now, I think that this seminar testifies that Derrida understood the question of negentropy from the point of view of the theory of information. And it is also in this perspective that, for example, he rejected in another text that is Spéculer sur Freud, I don't remember the title in English, in the postcard. He rejects, precisely he says, Freud is talking about entropy here, but don't take it into account, it's not interesting. And it's incredibly surprising. Why? It's because at this time, when Derrida gave this seminar on La Vie la Mort, and then 10 years later produced La Carte Postale, the postcard, it was, the public discussion was dominated by the theory of information. And François Jacob, for example, developed his neo-Darwinist view with the conceptions of entropy and negentropy coming from Claude Shannon in understanding of these questions. And for me, Shannon is a bad interpretation of negentropy. When I say bad, I say it's not bad for telecommunications industry, because Shannon was an engineer working for making signals passing into the networks. He was not at all a theoretician. But there was a misunderstanding because he produced an equation that was exactly the same, not himself, but his colleague, I don't remember his name now, that was, sorry? No, not Weaver, no, another one. I don't remember his name now. It was exactly the same like the Boltzmann constant. And everybody said, yes, now the theory of information is a new formalism for entropy and negentropy. And it's absolutely wrong, because it was not the stake for Shannon. Shannon used that for probabilistic management of information. But negentropy is not at all a question of probabilistic management. It is a question of bifurcation. And here we must read Bertalanffy, the theoretician of what he called open systems as a biologist. And he said, I was anticipating cybernetics before Wiener. I think it's not interesting to discuss that. But now when Wiener developed his view, he was ambiguous. He was between Schrödinger and Shannon. And this is the reason for which the 5th chapter of Cybernetics and Society is so bad, because it's really bad. And I believe it is because of this chapter that Heidegger rejected completely Wiener. Because Wiener said you can reduce language into information in this chapter. And I personally absolutely disagree with that. So, and this is what is happening now with Google and with the algorithmic governmentality of language that is destroying the negentropic possibilities of language, that is of thinking. So, I think that for Derrida, but also for almost all those philosophers, but Lyotard, because Lyotard tried to, I discussed myself with Lyotard about these questions. And he published 2 texts about entropy and negentropy that are completely different. And the problem with Deleuze was also that Deleuze was influenced by Stengers and Prigogine. And for me, when Prigogine says, for example, that a dissipative structure is negantropic, I completely disagree with that. Because negantropy is only describing living things. And a vortex is not at all a living thing because it doesn't have any memory. This is a question of memory as Nietzsche understood very well, that defines what is life. So, and it is also the question for Schrödinger. Now, the reason for I work now myself with Giuseppe Longo, the mathematician, and he coined with Francis Bailly, who was a physicist working with Prigogine, and with Maël Monteville, who is a biologist, the concept of anti-entropy. Why? Because they want to distinguish anti-entropy from negantropy. They say, let's say that negantropy is order in the sense of Prigogine. In such a case, we can describe a vortex, for example, as a negantropic structure. But there is anti-entropy, and a vortex will never produce anti-entropy. So those questions were erased by Derrida, because he considered, I discussed that with him because we gave together a seminar on biology in the 90s. And one day I said we could invite Henri Atlan, and he said, no, never Henri Atlan, because he's completely stupid. He's reducing life into information. It's absolutely unbearable. So, and I agree with him, of course, even if I consider it's important to discuss with him. But, there is a problem for Derrida with this, and La Villamor is very, very interesting and important, but it discusses a conception of negantropy that comes from the theory of information. It doesn't address the question of Schrödinger, and this is a real question. But Jacob never quotes Schrödinger, and it is Schrödinger was, in a way, repressed by biology, and he was not a biologist, he was a physicist. And it's only with Longo and Bailly that Schrödinger was really reactivated from the necro-mass for thinking these questions.
There's two questions, one from Ian, one from Avery. Down here.
Thank you. Just a quick question. Heidegger's Ereignis as appropriation. Is there any productive link? He says On Time and Being, Ereignis is that which gives being and time. So is there any link with what you talk about in terms of retention?
Yes, in a way I agree with you, but I claim that if really Heidegger wants to think Ereignis as appropriation, or in French it's translated co-appropriation, that is not exactly appropriation, because appropriation is eliminating the difference. And co-appropriation is organizing the meeting between something in which you cannot reduce the difference. For me, it's very important. Of course, behind this is Eigentlichkeit, and the question of the Eigentlich. I think Heidegger is opening something completely new, exactly like Husserl opened something completely new in The Origin of Geometry, transforming all the statements of phenomenology into something completely different, and this is what Derrida understood very well. But in France, for example, for me, the French so-called Heideggerian philosophers don't understand the stakes of the last Heidegger, because the last Heidegger says the question is not at all to reject modern technology, it is to eragnate modern technology, that is to co-appropriate, and it is a new era, he says, the end of philosophy and the beginning of a new kind of thought. Now, the problem is that he rejects the question of entropy. So he cannot address the question of negantropy. And this is the reason for which I consider that we have to continue the work of Heidegger, but by criticizing what he says about Wiener, for example, or cybernetics. And here, this is the stake of what I call the epistemology of the digital, that is of calculation, of technologies of calculation that are not the evil, but the future. So how to deal with calculation? This is a real question. And for Heidegger, it's not possible to say that. This is the reason for which I stay in a kind of distance with him.
Thank you so much for such a wonderful talk. I wanted to ask you about how the notion of error or glitch plays into your discussion of technology, the exhaust-somatization of information, and post-truth. And thinking back to the Shannon example with entropy, he's using a negative probability to describe what amount of signal gets to the other end, as you were saying, right? How much error is in the message.
Yeah.
Yeah? There was a very interesting error in the messages you were showing us with the snake. You showed us the caduceus, the first caduceus that we have for the AMA, which is actually a typesetter error for the original staff of Asclepius. And that's why there's one staff that has one snake, which is Asclepius. And when the AMA was making their symbol, they said, we want that staff with the snake. And the printer made an error and put the caduceus, which, as you had also pictures of, is the staff that leads people to the underworld. So it was a very unfortunate typo, but they left it because they said, well, people won't know the difference. Of course, there is a difference that makes a difference, right? It seems to me that there are two different kinds of errors possible here. And I was wondering if you could talk just a little bit about how error in the world of data patterns matters. Is this just yet another kind of thing we can commoditize? It doesn't matter if there's an error, the message goes on. Or does error in some way offer a kind of critical purchase for you?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a very important question, of course. We have in probabilistic calculation, for example, a margin of error. And it is, such an error is, let's call that the classical understanding of what is an error. That is, error thought from what Heidegger called, after Plato, orthotes, that is exactitude. And so it's a definition of error as the contrary of truth, itself defined as exactitude, that is calculation, or not necessarily calculation, but logic, for example, logic resolution of a proposition, etc., etc. Now, for me, error is, of course, the most important question of truth. Why? Because truth is time. So truth always becomes error. What does that mean? Truth is not a result, as Hegel said. It is a process. So if you want to transmit truth, you must transmit the process, not the result. So you must transmit the process of individuation as it is pharmacological. So being pharmacological, it necessarily becomes toxic. That is error. That is, I don't know how to say that in English, but in French, errance, as it was also thematized by Heidegger, who said that truth is errance. But what is such an errance? It is a process in the sense of Whitehead. So, and here, of course, I would like also to connect not only Derrida with Simonon, but also Heidegger with Whitehead. Because here you have a dynamic, and the question is a dynamic. I think that Derrida and Heidegger was very close to these questions, but they didn't address themselves as such because they had a reserve with these questions of processuality, for example. And Now you have error as the destiny of truth. That is not an error in the sense of inexactitude, but the question of time. That is entropy. Everything becomes entropic. Even Hegel, even Plato, even Socrates, everything becomes entropic. This is what is said by Maurice Blanchot when he says everything will disappear. Because everything will be transformed into entropy. Now, I remember that suddenly I didn't answer a dimension of your question about Derrida and truth. Truth is always local. When I say local, it's at the level of the cosmos. For example, the biosphere is a singularity for physics, astrophysics. And it's a singularity in this sense that this is what was showed by Vernadsky. You can have life only on Earth. And you can have such production of water, oxygen, etc., only thanks to what he called biochemistry of Earth. So you cannot explain this with physics. And this is very, very important to reintroduce this question of locality. I say that because at the end of my talk, I showed the website of a group we created in the suburbs of Paris for struggling against the economic crisis. And we say that we have to relaunch a valuation of negentropy, that is knowledge and not proletarianization. But such a valuation is always local. You cannot evaluate, for example, this knowledge of mechanics coming from the West Africa, people coming from Senegal and Mali mainly. In Saint-Denis, you have around 500, 1,000 mechanicians, people repairing cars, etc. They have an incredible knowledge coming from Africa. And now, if you want to evaluate that, you must create a local economy. That is a very, very complicated and dangerous question. Why? Because if you follow, for example, the French novels of politics, the political program of the National Front is locality, localism. So we have to revisit this question of locality, struggling against what? Heidegger's temptation to follow nationalism. And it's really a question of philosophy today in the context of the Earth, where what do we mean by truth? If we want to address the question of the post-truth era, we must address this question. And it is a very dangerous one, but we must not reject it, all to the contrary.
Okay, we've reached that time of the day where we have to let people go off to do what they're going to do, but I'd really like you all to thank Bernard Stiegler for his detailed talk and generous responses.
Thank you very much.